Now let me pose my third question to you, and this question is now focused on the Ukraine and Ukrainian situation here. I know that you travel extensively all over the world, and I realize that you are here for the first time in this country, in Lviv, and also at this university. But still, I think that even after a few days that you can spend here in this country, you may have some insights as to the situation generally here. And my question is, the country is going through different and difficult sometimes times. The political situation is not that easy and it's complicated. Economical situation is not clear as well, even though it seems that we are making some progress. And generally, Ukraine seems to be in the middle, and the border situation being between the European Union and Russia, and so there's a whole kind of geopolitical situation which is as well complex and delicate in a sense. But then I'm thinking about the Ukrainian academic community, meaning universities, for example, and community of professors and scholars and students. And I think that something important has to happen in that world, on that kind of academic landscape in this country. And my simple question would be, what would you expect to happen? What would you like to happen on that academic landscape in a country like this, at this time? And in that context, if you may also make a comment, well, this is a very small university, as you know now, having probably less than 1% of student body of the city. I'm not even mentioning the whole country. And some people may be very pessimistic as to the role and goals of this university, thinking that what kind of influence this university can make. I mean, it can train a few couple hundreds of students probably, but by its size, it will never play any significant role in this country. Is this so? What would you expect as well from this kind of university, from this type of university, to do for this country at this time?
Professor Turchynovskyy, if you will allow me a personal comment before I try to reply to your question. You are full of questions this morning, Professor Turchynovskyy, and sadly, as you yourself pointed out, I am very poor in experience of at least Ukraine and of Lviv and of your university. And the second personal remark, if you allow me, is that you exaggerate when you talk of my many travels, traveling all the time. Through circumstances, it is true that I have seen repeatedly over a number of years, a number of different ways of institutionalizing higher education in Japan, in Germany, France, Canada, the United States, in Eastern Europe as well, but never in Africa, never in South America, never in other places. I know something about Korea, but nothing about China. So, everything, I haven't traveled all that much, and I must say that traveling here is very special because of my awareness of what you and your colleagues at this very small university are caught up in and are trying to do. Now, let me come to at least some aspects, some elements of the several questions you've asked in this third theme. You ask, what would I expect to happen in, say, Ukraine at this time? What would I like to happen in Ukraine at this time, and how would I, if I were thinking of an ideal, what would I imagine as an ideal for this university? Well, so far as what I expect to happen, I, as you can expect, cannot really reply very helpfully because while I'm careful to read the European papers on a daily basis, in several languages, I do not understand Ukrainian or Russian for that matter, so I'm really very ignorant. On the other hand, I have fears about what could happen in Ukraine, and some of these fears I'm sure you probably share with me. So I'm confused when I arrive in Ukraine, So let me generalize then and ask you to excuse me for not having particulars. I see Ukraine and its present situation as caught up in what I've called elsewhere the immensities of innocent suffering and the immensities of the evils that bring these sufferings about. This is Ukraine's tragic history, but it is also the tragic history of many other places in the world. It's very important for Ukraine to see that there is a solidarity, not just in very good things, but sometimes there's a solidarity in suffering. Now, this means that Ukraine, without perhaps quite knowing it, shares certain extraordinary features of other places in the world today that are trying to live through the transition period from a time where the vastness of evil brought about a vastness of suffering. Now, you point out that Ukraine is somewhat on the margins, somewhat between Europe on the one hand, Russia on the other hand, and you haven't mentioned, of course, the southern area, but you're aware of that as well. I see this, let's call it, marginal location of Ukraine, that's the spatial coordinate, in the light of this temporal background, the as yet unmastered history of Ukraine. I see this as more of an opportunity than a liability. I see that the efforts Ukrainian people are making today to carry through the transition is full of food for thought for perhaps more stable regions such as Europe. And while not that stable, Russia itself is somehow or other, because of its vastness, is certainly a different type of power than Ukraine is. So both Russia and Europe can, in, I think, important ways, look to what might happen in Ukraine's extraordinary attempts to work its way successfully through this transitional period, and learn from the lessons of Ukraine how to re-articulate its own boundaries, Europe to articulate its boundaries, Russia to articulate its, and perhaps with some overlapping of these boundaries. That's the second point. What would I like to see happen? In the light of what I've been saying, and particularly this university, IIECI, yes, 1% of the student population of Lviv and 0.00% of the student population of Ukraine is an impressive number. At the same time, remember what that phrase, which goes back to my boyhood when I first began studying, that I learned from my teachers, and I quoted it during the conference. Non multa sed multum. Not many things, but much of one thing. That echoes the pre-Socratic saying that the fox knows many things. The hedgehog, the groundhog, knows only one thing, one big thing. What is the one big thing? What is that much of one what? As a philosopher, and not knowing anything really about one of the great contributions that only IIECI is making in theological education, I can only speak of philosophical education, I believe it's worthwhile considering the one big thing, the much of one thing, as the development of critical thinking and self-critical thinking. Even if there is just a small group of skilled young people who are able to articulate critically in an argumentative and respectful way their particular perspective on things. And in addition, if these critical young people are also sufficiently self-critical, this becomes the leaven in a much larger university mass. And that's why the certificate program in philosophy, which has been such a success in its first year and now is being carried on for another year, and who knows, maybe someday an MA program in philosophy, this is full of promise, from my point of view, for leavening intellectual discussion in the Ukraine of tomorrow. And tomorrow is not far away. It's 3 to 5 years away. If UKU, in addition to its unique service to the entire country and community, whether here or the diaspora abroad, is able to contribute theologians, is able to revive the understanding of Christian theology, that is one enormous contribution that the university is making. But since I know little about that, I can only talk about the philosophical contribution. And there, given the nature of the times, given the immense difficulties of a protracted transition, given the sense of intellectual, moral, perhaps spiritual disarray that we are all subject to, what more do we need from the philosophers today than the skills of critical thinking, the skills of self-critical thinking, but above all, oriented toward the practical realm? So I can imagine a small group of students gradually emerging from the philosophy programs at UKU and finding positions in social development, in the law, in, say, journalism, in areas such as policy planning, in government. And with these extraordinary analytical skills which they've acquired, and the self-critical humility that they've had to learn, putting those skills at the service of the emerging Ukraine at a time when Europe itself is redefining its boundaries. So although the numbers are small, there could be much of one good thing here. And that one good thing is critical inquiry, but not just of a situation, also of oneself, but at the service of the world, at the service of the practical needs that surround us. So not to produce future professors of philosophy, although 1 or 2 or 3 will probably appear, but to put oneself at the service of the larger community. Those are a few remarks.